This segment discusses Article 1 of the trust, which is generally 7 pages long for married trusts. Article 1 comes bundled separately because it contains the pivotal key clauses of the trust. In other words, Article 1 contains all the clauses which the trust revolves around. For instance, Article 1 sets forth your information, who the trustees and successor trustees are, the family, who inherits, and some other important provisions which the trust centers around, including the signature and notarization page for executing the trust. Doing it this way allows us to focus your attention on the parts of the trust that are generally the most relevant and personally important to you. And these provisions can all be found in the first pages of your trust in Article 1. The balance of the trust, which consists of numerous standard clauses, is bundled together in Exhibit A, which is discussed in a separate segment. Here, we concentrate on Article 1, the heart and soul of the trust. And remember, this is a revocable, amendable trust, and together you can change or amend any provision of your trust, anytime and as many times as you want. So, let's get started with page 1, which begins by stating that you are declaring a trust and also incorporates the provisions and articles of Exhibit A. The middle of page 1 sets forth the trust particulars, including who the settlers and first trustees of the trust are, the name and date of the trust, how title to assets should be held, and the tax ID, which is your social security number. Turning to page 2, you'll first find the names of your children listed. Just below that, you'll also find the provision that the trust shall also include any children subsequently born to you. Towards the bottom of page 2, you'll see that it sets forth your current nomination of first and successor trustees. This is one of the most important key clauses of the trust because the successor trustees are those you are nominating to manage, settle, and carry out the instructions of the trust. They serve in the order listed, only falling to the next person when the one above can't, won't, or is no longer able to serve as trustee. It is important not to confuse trustees with beneficiaries or those who inherit the estate. Trusteeship is legally a separate role and issue from that of inheriting or receiving a beneficial interest. That's known as being a beneficiary. That said, many times, but not always, a trustee is also a beneficiary, and thus also entitled to part of the estate, and that may be the case with your trust. Other times, however, trustees are not beneficiaries of the trust, and thus their part is confined to managing and carrying out the instructions of the trust. Whatever the case may be, don't confuse trusteeship with being a beneficiary, which is covered in the next few pages beginning on page 3. Page 3 sets forth who the beneficiary is, or who inherits, at the first spouse's death. This almost always calls for leaving everything outright to the surviving spouse, which is you'll generally see emphasized in bold capital letters. Just below that, you'll find some language that preserves the survivor's right to disclaim, something that a surviving spouse rarely does and usually only happens when the surviving spouse is not a U.S. citizen. Yet, in a repeating theme, it is there just in case. The next 2 pages, 4 and 5, specify your beneficiaries, that is, who you want to inherit after both spouses are deceased. For married couples, our approach and trust structure is for you each to state and confirm your wishes, even though they are generally the same. Thus, page 4 states and confirms the husband's wishes, and page 5 states and confirms the wife's wishes. The most common inheritance provision, and the one displayed on the example page, typically calls for the trust estate to be distributed to your descendants by right of representation. This is a compact legal way of saying that the estate shall be divided equally among your children, but what it also means is if a child does not survive, then such share shall go to the non-survivor's children or descendants. In other words, they stand in their parents' stead by right of representation. However, if a predeceased child has no legal descendants, then such share would be divided among your other children. Descendants by right of representation is by far the most common inheritance provision, and is also largely consistent with the intestate laws that govern when someone dies without an estate plan. In other words, it is generally what the law believes you would want. For those that are not specifying descendants by right of representation, you'll generally also find your particular inheritance provisions spelled out on pages 4 and 5. On these same pages, everyone will also find provisions for the young person's trust that set forth the age a beneficiary must attain to manage their own inheritance. If a beneficiary is below the threshold age, then such share remains in trust and is governed by the terms of the young person's trust until the beneficiary reaches the age that you specified. During that time, the trustee manages the inheritance and essentially acts as your gatekeeper with the wide discretion to make distributions for the beneficiary's health, education, and support. The goal of these provisions is to grant your trustee the power to exercise this discretion the same as you would. For instance, if the beneficiary is pursuing their education or otherwise striving to become a productive member of society, the trustee can generously support that. On the other hand, the trustee can be very stingy if the beneficiary just wants to be a bum on the beach, spend all their time partying, buy a Ferrari, or God forbid has a substance abuse problem. The whole idea is to prevent a young or immature beneficiary from quickly squandering or misspending the inheritance, as the young are often prone to do. While there may be no young beneficiaries when the time comes, it is still important that these provisions are there just in case. At the top of the next page, you'll find a clause entitled Possible Distributions of Household and Personal Effects. Rather than requiring the usual formality of notarizations associated with modifying a trust, this clause provides a relaxed standard that allows you to more easily designate the distribution of certain minor gifts, household and personal effects, meaning it doesn't need to be witnessed or notarized. In essence, it allows you to prepare your own informal document, which need only appear in the trustee's reasonable belief to address instructions for distributions of minor household and personal effects. It should, however, at least be dated and signed, and unless you state otherwise, such gifts shall be on top of, not deducted from the beneficiary's share of the estate. Finally, we move to the last page of Article 1, which is the execution and acknowledgement page. This is where you should sign your trust, and each of you should sign twice where indicated, just above your names. The area below is for the notary, so please do not sign in the notary area. As always, you should have your documents notarized as soon as possible. Please be sure the notary completes both acknowledgement areas below, as the notary needs to acknowledge your signatures as settlers and again as trustees.